Welcome back, everyone, to our study of the parables of Jesus. We're so glad that you've been with us through looking at these different stories that Jesus told to convey truth, to use metaphors, illustrations, everyday examples, to provide for people clarity concerning the truth of God. And we're going to be looking at one of those parables today. It's titled The Parable of the Evil Tenants. Now, before we read it, let me say that as we dive into this story, what I'm going to do is I'm going to read it first. There's 12 verses, and then we'll break it down and just kind of give some general statements about the parable, and then we'll look at it in detail and arrive at some applicational points. And so again, this is the parable of the evil tenants. Let's get right to it. Matthew 21, verses 33 to 45. It says that Jesus told another story. He says, "Now listen to another story. A certain landowner planted a vineyard, we're told, built a wall around it, and dug a pit for pressing out the grape juice, and built a lookout tower. Then he leased the vineyard to tenant farmers and moved to another country." Verse 34. "At the time of the grape harvest, he sent his servants to collect his share of the crop. But the farmers, the tenant farmers that is, grabbed his servants, beat one, killed one, and stoned another." Verse 36. "So the landowner sent a large group of his servants to collect for him, but the results were the same." Verse 37. "Finally, the owner sent his son, thinking, 'Surely they will respect my son.' Verse 38. "But when the tenant farmers saw his son coming, they said to one another, 'Here comes the heir to the estate. Come on, let's kill him and get the estate for ourselves.' So they grabbed him, dragged him out of the vineyard, and they murdered him." Verse 40. "When the owner of the vineyard returns, Jesus asked, 'What do you think he will do to those farmers?' Verse 41. "The religious leaders replied, 'He will put the wicked men to a horrible death and lease the vineyard to others who will give him his share of the crop after each harvest.'" Verse 42. "Then Jesus asked them, 'Didn't you ever read this in the scriptures?'" And he's going to quote Psalm 118. "The stone," Jesus says, "that the builders rejected has now become the cornerstone. This is the Lord's doing, and it is a wonderful thing to see." Verse 43, "I tell you, the kingdom of God will be taken away from you and given to a nation that will produce the proper fruit." Verse 44, "Anyone who stumbles over that stone will be broken into pieces, and it will crush anyone it falls on." Verse 45, "When the leading priests and Pharisees heard this parable, they realized he was telling the story against them, and that they were the wicked farmers, and they wanted to arrest him, but they were afraid of the crowds who considered Jesus to be a prophet." Wow. This is some story, and I would imagine that those who were listening, including the religious leaders and the Pharisees, were quote unquote on the edge of their seat. Let's talk about a few things here. First of all, the context of the parable. This is taking place most likely Wednesday of the Holy Week, which means that the cross of Christ is looming. And it's also coming after the historic cleansing of the temple. And Jesus is walking freely in the temple, and he's returned there to teach. This is the temple, same temple that he cleaned. Remember, his first order of business after his triumphal entry was to clean the temple, because the temple during Passover time in particular had become a place of e-commerce for the religious leaders. The high priest and his sons had set up some system, okay? They were economically profiting from people during Passover. If you brought a lamb, they inspected it and they would say, "Nope, that lamb has a blemish, you got to use our lamb." And their lamb was significantly higher in cost than the lamb you may have bought from the town or country you traveled from. Well, now you had to buy it, so you had to use their currency. Some biblical economists estimate that they charged 3 times the cost 3 to 1 on the exchange rate And so they got you coming and they got you going. And it said that they would make upwards of $3 million a Passover. That's what the temple had become. And even when Jesus went in there, he saw people buying and selling goods, and he kicked people out, and he said, "What? My house, my Father's house shall not be a house of robbers and thieves. My Father's house shall be a house of prayer." And so he cleanses the temple. A beautiful picture of even our own lives, that our hearts need to be made clean with God. And Christ is the only one that could do that. So that takes place. Now Jesus returns, and he's walking freely in the temple that he cleansed. And this infuriates, drives them nuts. You've already had the kids during the triumphal entry, basically have more spiritual insight than the grown-ups and the religious leaders. And so, you've had praise thrown at Jesus. I believe that was genuine from those children out of the mouth of babes, right? And now you have this parable that he's teaching. I believe this also comes after when he talks about the tree with the leaves, and that was illustrating the religious leaders in Israel at the time. Although they looked nice and shiny on the outside, behind the leaves there was no fruit. And so this parable comes in that line, and it's part of a trilogy that we're covering in these parables, these judgment parables, these parables that are ultimately revealing to these religious leaders who they are and what they lack. He's essentially unmasking their hypocrisy, and he's calling out their pretense, and it is driving them crazy that he's able to do that. And so let's talk about the main statement of this parable, okay? The parable of the evil tenants, these evil tenant farmers, summarizes Israel's spiritual history and its ultimate rejection of the Messiah. And that's what this is to serve as a picture of. And we'll talk about how this can apply to my life and your life. Yes, this was directed to the religious leaders, but there's also something for us to learn, and we'll cover that on the back end. Let's talk about some of these main characters, okay? First of all, you have the landowner. He represents God the Father, who owns it all and who is the one leasing out the property. The tenants represent Israel's religious elite. These religious leaders and those who sit at the top of the food chain, they are represented by these tenants that did something that was very bad. The servants represent the prophets, those who went first and second to try to collect from these tenants what was rightfully a profit that belonged to the owner. The people that were killed initially, they represent the prophets, because the prophets' messages had fallen on deaf ears. Prophets were persecuted. We know all about that, okay? And obviously, the son who was also killed represents Jesus. And so those are the main characters. Now, the location, the vineyard symbolizes Israel, okay? The vineyard as a whole symbolizes the geographical location of Israel. Israel with its fortified fences, okay? The winepress and the tower reflect really Isaiah 5, and it's indicating ultimately God's protection and his provision, the same way it did in Isaiah 5. That's what this winepress is also symbolizing, God's provisional. There was great resources that came from this line of work and business, by the way. The export of the grape juice and what that was significant for. And so there was also medical usages of that as well. And so the exporting properties alone and the profits alone were significant on this. And so, yes, there would have been a profit to return. Yes, the tenants would have been more than able to meet whatever the obligation, whatever the contractual agreement was. But they didn't want to do that. They were so concerned with their own wherewithal, with their own profit, that they forgot the landowner. And that's why this perfectly symbolizes Israel's relationship with God. He had blessed them with his protection, with his provision, and yet all throughout their history, they have these lapses in judgment. They have what seems like amnesia. They forget what God has done for them. And even so much so as we come to the New Testament with the Messiah, that the Messiah is right in front of them. The Son is there, and they have a hand in the Son going to the cross, okay? And so now, let's break this down, okay? Go back to verse 33, if you will, okay? I just want to highlight a few things here. It says now he told them another story. You probably want to circle that word, another, okay? It comes from the Greek word allos, and it means another of the same kind. So for example, if you were at a bakery and they brought you a cookie, and here's another cookie, and it was a similar cookie. That's what that would mean. It'd be another cookie in that family. They brought you another cookie. It was similar. Maybe it was a chocolate chip cookie at first, then chocolate chip and peanut butter, and then chocolate chip and pistachio, whatever it might have been. It's one of the same kind. And that's what this parable is. It's another parable of the same kind, because he just gave them the parable that we looked at in our last session, the parable of the two sons. And just like that parable, what's being illustrated perfectly, because Jesus is the master teacher, the perfect storyteller, the perfect teacher, he is illustrating, again, the folly of the rejection that the religious elite and the religious leaders had towards him, and how God had a plan in sending the Messiah. This is nothing new. It's been prophesied about in the Old Testament. They just chose to reject it. And so verse 33, again, the Wednesday of the Holy Week, is illustrating these great spiritual truths that we have already been talking about with the previous parable, and now we'll get into here. And so verse 33 begins with that. And then he told them another parable, so another of the same kind, in other words, about the folly of the judgment. Now, it says a certain landowner planted a vineyard. This would have been a very familiar metaphor, because what would happen is the landowner, as he excavated his property, and they've actually done some pretty remarkable things in ancient history without technology, without the machinery that we have today. I mean, it's really a fascinating study when you do a deep dive on that. But they would take a land, and they would, somebody would buy a land, however, or trade. And then he would excavate it, as we like to say. He didn't have bulldozers, but by hand they would excavate the land. And usually on the slope of the land was where they would dig the wine press. And it would be there for several reasons. Obviously, access was a big point, and perhaps also maybe sunlight and daylight and the ability to work, and how that also affected the harvest of the grapes. And so this was a very familiar scene. This would not be something out of the ordinary. And again, Jesus is using a metaphor that would really captivate their attention. The story's going to take a twist. We're also told that they built a wall around it. That was the security. And that's where they also put a lookout tower, and that was to make sure if any enemies, any thieves were coming. And we're told that he leased the vineyard to tenant farmers, then he moved away to another country. And so here's this landowner. He's doing what a lot of landowners do. He's in real estate. He's a real estate mogul, okay? He leases it out to tenants. Now, maybe you own property where you have tenants. Some of you might have some wild stories about some really bad tenants that they didn't pay their rent. Maybe they reneged on the agreements. They trashed the place. Maybe they falsified information about their background or their deposit or something, and you might go, I got the worst tenant story of all time, or I heard the worst. You haven't had anything as bad as this. I mean, these are bad dudes, okay? These are terrible tenants, because an agreement has been made, the lease has been signed. They have a great opportunity here to do very well. The grape wine press business excelled in ancient times. They had every opportunity. This property has been, listen, this has been dug out. This is turnkey, great opportunity for return on your investment of paying this lease. Now, verse 35, 34, and 35 begin to tell us that at the time of the harvest, the landowner sends people to collect what's rightfully his. He decides to take a portion. Perhaps the slope on the hillside was, this common place for the vineyard where people planted vineyards, and he had that envisioned, that this is where this is going to be, and he was going to make money from that and money from another piece of the land. Whatever the case may have been, this man in this story was doing this to turn a profit legally. There's nothing wrong with that. But now we're going to find out something, very, very crazy. Even today, if you travel to the land of Israel, you'll see many remnants of old wine presses. Again, it was a prominent business and digs, and even in more contemporary settings. But that's what's happening here. And again, this landowner has gone to great detail. I don't want you to miss that. The tower, the surrounding areas, security, shelter, storage, they could really excel here. And so the point of all of this is to just demonstrate how great of a care and detail this landowner put into all of this. So I revisit that because what we're about to read next almost seems out of place. If you were going to start a business and your landlord did everything he could to help you succeed, you'd be very happy to be there. And the last thing you would do is mistreat or misuse anything that was connected to the landlord. Well, verse 35, when they came to collect, as it was time for the grape harvest, verse 35 again takes an interesting, an incredible twist, a horrific twist. But the farmers grabbed the servants, beat one, killed one, and stoned another. What? Wait a minute. This guy gave them ample opportunity to succeed. I'm sure there's a profit, but they don't want to pay it. They don't want to be faithful with that which they've been given. That's always a problem in life. And this series here, they beat one. Beat one gives us the understanding of somebody being beat slowly, like, hitting him with blows. Like, maybe they jumped him, in other words. They jumped this servant and they threw him a beating so bad, he banged his head up and they just kept kicking him and stomping. They stomped his life out. The next word in Greek, killed one, that's the same word used as flaging someone, like they stabbed them. So now we're getting a little quicker. First they beat the first guy. The second guy, now they stab him. And the next guy, they stoned him, which means they killed him instantly. Somebody took a boulder and crushed the guy's skull. Nice tenants. You thought you had bad tenants, okay? That's what they did. So the landowner then hears the report, and it says he sent a larger group of his servants to go collect for him. But crazy as it might sound, the results were the same. This is an amazing series of events. Every time I read this parable, you think it's like a movie, that you didn't see this twist coming. When everybody in the movie theater, if you're watching the movie at home, like there's a gasp, a collective gasp all at once as these events begin to take place. Beating him, slashing him, stoning him. I mean, it's terrible. And it's incredible in a wicked sense. I guess that's why another name for this parable is the wicked tenants. For that reason, they became independent. They became resentful. They had become filled with apparently hatred for the owner. They had become overly possessive. They thought it was theirs. It's not theirs. They're just leasing it. But these are the things that I think drove them to this. They wanted everything, and they didn't want to give to whom it was due. And all of this resulted in the madness of murder. But even in all of this, the owner is gracious. You or I, we might have done something else. Even after the first servants went. But he doesn't do that. And look at verse 36 one more time. It says, again, he sent other servants, more than the first group. And they did the same thing to them. They killed all of them. No matter who they sent, the results were the same as we just read. And so this indicates that something very egregious has taken place. They have taken the generousness, the graciousness, and mercifulness of this landowner, and they have trampled on it, in my opinion. And so the landowner is going to do something next that is very interesting. See, some critics have said, well, this makes the parable a little far-fetched. Nobody would keep sending servants. And yes, that is the point, that it is far-fetched. God's love and his graciousness is almost impossible for the human mind to comprehend. There are times we get it, but there are times we just don't. It's way above us. And so the reply to that statement might be, that's correct because, of what this represents, but the parable becomes utterly uncommon. And it's in its uncommonness that we see in this heinous act, we see the goodness of God shining through of all of this. And so, verse 37, we're told, finally, the owner sent his son. And he's thinking, you know what? Here comes my son. Certainly, they would not have that behavior to my son. Certainly, they wouldn't treat him like that. Certainly, they wouldn't do anything to my son. Here comes my son. And guess what? Look what it says now. They grabbed him and they dragged him out and they killed him because they said, let's go kill him because he is next of kin. He's the one who's going to get the land after the father passes. We take him out. We wait the father out. Well, maybe we kill him too. But this land is ours. I mean, again, the wickedness of all of this is staggering. And so, as it continues on, the religious leaders are asked by Jesus the question, and I repeat it, how and what do you think the landowner would do to those farmers? And they said, well, he'd go put them to death. He would take care of these wicked men, and he would take care of them. And then Jesus says something that was kind of, man, talk about a sharp, stick to them. He says, have you never read the scriptures? I mean, of course they've read the scriptures. I mean, this was really to put them in their place. Because then he's going to quote Psalm 18. And Psalm 18 is from the part of the scripture which describes the promised Messiah as the cornerstone. There have been archaeological digs and discoveries on cornerstones, and they're quite remarkable. The size of them, the weight of them, the positioning of them. And it's almost to the fact where, again, as I mentioned this earlier, it's just fascinating to see how they were able to get all of that which they were doing in these spots and moving it and carrying it and so forth and on. But Jesus is going to quote Psalm 118, which describes the Messiah as the cornerstone. And he's saying to them that, in essence, you have rejected the cornerstone. You've rejected the one the Father sent. The Father has blessed you, literally, with land. The Father has blessed you with his protection, with his provision, with all that you could ever need for generations. Going all the way back to the parting of the Red Sea, God has been faithful. The Father has been faithful, just as the landowner went to great detail to ensure not only the success of these tenants, but their safety, okay? Not only that, he made it a way that they would be self-sufficient. However, just like those tenants, the leadership of Israel had taken that which God had entrusted to them, used it for their own selfish gains, and as we'll see by the end of the Holy Week, they will be guilty of ultimately, verbally, full-throat rejection of the Messiah, the cornerstone that God has given. And so then, what might be the interpretation of this in terms of an applicational standpoint? We know this is talking about Israel. They even said it, okay, Then they wanted to arrest them. They were crazy about it, but then they thought, well, the crowds, we can't do it now. And that right there, that verse 46, they wanted to arrest him. They would eventually get their wish. Holy Thursday into Good Friday, in the darkness of the night, they would arrest him and subject him to not one, not two, but 6 unjust trials, and obviously eventually being brought before the crowd, and the crowd chanting for Barabbas to be set free, but for Jesus to be crucified. And they had a major role to play in that. Yes, God is sovereign, and this was his plan, but these men were wicked, and those actions that are about to take place in less than 24 hours is this parable in a nutshell. So then you might ask, okay, how do we apply that then to our lives? Well, I think it's extremely applicable. I think we need to be mindful of God's eyes, how he's watching and he's seeing how people are acting and how people are behaving. We might think we're getting away with it, but we're not. I mean, that's why I look at it here. I mean, they probably thought, man, we're making this and we're making this much amount of money and we're going. God sees it all, and eventually your sin will find you out. God leaves room for repentance. I believe that. God is so gracious to you and I. But if we continue to walk in the directions that God doesn't approve, well, there's going to be justice. There's going to be a revealing. And I think that's what's happening here is he's revealing, they've been doing this for so long. They didn't just start doing this. They've been doing this. And so Jesus is calling it out. But there are some applicational points for you and I, because we don't want to in any way neglect the provisions, the promises, and even the precious peace that God has given to us. That's what he gave to them. That's what that vineyard and how it looks represents. He didn't just give them, a fixer-upper vineyard, okay? They didn't just sign a triple net lease and, okay, you got to do this, I got to do that, and that's it. He did everything for them. They got to go just make money. And they did not want to return a profit, which was evil, which was wrong, which represents Israel. They had forsaken their first love. They had forsaken the responsibilities of being a good steward before God, and look what it resulted in. So here are the applicational points, how we could apply the parable of the evil tenants to our lives. First of all, this is something we need to remember. God is the owner and we are the manager, or in this story, the leasee, okay? God is the owner. We need to get that through our thick heads, and that'll change how we respond to God and to other people. He is the owner. We serve at the pleasure of the King. All that we have, all that we could ever hope to aspire to be, is connected to that truth. Number two, God is gracious and generous. Look how this landowner was patient, was merciful, even though these evil farmers did what they did, not once, not twice, but 3 times. 3 rejections. And I think that kind of ties into, 3 days and then rose on the 3rd day, perhaps. I don't know, but God is gracious and he's generous. And you see that in these parable stories. He's just, but he's also patient and loving. And we see that here. The other thing that we want to point out, the next principle is, rejection and rebellion will result in real consequences. There are consequences here for this. And these men, these people, would be thrown out essentially, that there would be hell to pay for that, that there would be a problem with the landowner because of all of this. And we're going to have a problem too with God if we act the way that we act and we are being disobedient or we're not following God. It's going to have ramifications. There are real consequences. And we don't want to be on the opposite side of the cross. We don't want to be an enemy of the cross. We want to walk with God. We want to believe in that which he has said from his word and seek to obediently follow him. Now, there's one last thing here that we want to share, and it's fitting that we close with that, and that is that Jesus is the cornerstone. Jesus is that cornerstone that they rejected. He is the cornerstone which they rebelled against. The cornerstone in any property was extremely significant because it was upon which that cornerstone that in ancient times they built everything else in the structure. And so, as we say these things, I want you to consider this parable again. Okay? What in your life might need to be given over to God? What might be fake? What might be disingenuous? What might be insincere? Give that over to God. In your life right now, what might you need to be doing, okay, to properly look at a parable like this and say, God, convict me of the wickedness that's in my own life that needs to be given over to you in confession. Because I believe there are real consequences for rebellion. And then finally, why don't you commit to Jesus being the cornerstone of your life, that you want to build your life on him. He is the cornerstone. He's the rock. And as it says at the close of the Sermon on the Mount in Matthew chapter 7, the storms came, but the house that stood was not the house built on sand, but the house that was built on the rock. You want to build all your convictions, all your commitments, and your character on the solid ground, the solid rock. On this solid ground I stand. Let that be our mantra. Let that be that which is on the tip of our tongue, because the parable of the evil tenants is a picture, is a microcosm, a summary, if you will, of not only the condition of Israel, but also the heart of mankind. And we don't want to be guilty of rejecting the Son. We want to receive the Son. And we want to give the Son his due, which is us, which is our love, which is our kindness, which is our soul. We want to give that to the Son. We want to trust the Son for the forgiveness of our sins and for eternal life. And then we want to live the rest of our life giving God the glory for all the blessings, okay? All the profits we make, we want to return them to God. We want to take the blessings God gives to us and use them in ways that bring honor to Him, because He's the owner after all, and we've been entrusted to be His steward, His manager. And so to God be the glory for this parable. A parable of judgment, but a sobering judgment. A judgment that says to me and to you this day, get it right. Be on the path that you need to be on. Trust me and my plan for you. And like these tenants, we're put in a position to flourish. We just need to trust and do the right thing. And so we'll end with that note. Let us trust God and let us seek to bring honor to Him by doing what is right, and we'll leave the results to Him. Yes, this is a parable titled The Evil Tenants, the Evil Tenant Farmers. But even in the midst of the horrific events described in this story, the great story of the Son of God shines through, and may that encourage you this hour. Thank you for being with us, and we'll see you next time.